Compare the Ottoman Empire in the 1600s to Europe in the 1600s, and what similarities and differences do you notice? First of all, you can look at both of them as certainly having the idea of absolute monarchs at the head. This is, of course, the time of the French monarch, the English monarch, um, the Holy Roman Empire, the Prussian monarchs, the Russian monarchs, trying to get as much authority and power underneath them as well. The idea of divine monarchy or monarchy essentially kind of being gifted to or presented to these rulers in a religious sense from God, very similar to the idea of the Ottoman sultans. I know they're perceived of as being not just having secular authority, but also having religious authority as well, kind of taking on that role of caliphs and kind of being the caretakers of the Islamic religion. Both of these locations, the Ottoman Empire and lots of the various countries within Europe, were very expansionist. We see the expansion into Eastern Europe, into North Africa on the part of the Ottoman Empire. From Europe's standpoint, we see the expansion into the Americas as well as into East Asia and so forth. Both of them have a lot of social stratification within them. Although the social stratification may have been a bit more rigid within Europe than it was in the Ottoman Empire, we'll certainly see in our document exercise coming up how an observer from Europe classifies there being essentially kind of less social stratification and more of a meritocracy within the Ottoman Empire than existed within Europe. But still, it's a society that is broken down into several different classes of people, with the majority of the wealth and the power residing amongst those who are in the upper class. Both societies are very religious at this point in time. The churches within Europe, as well as the Islamic faith within the Ottoman Empire, having a very profound impact in the way that the laws are constructed, in the way that society is run, as well as the way that the rulers and leaders are ruling their countries. Finally, both of these locations are very globally connected. We see examples of the Ottoman Empire reaching out, engaging in the Columbian Exchange, the popular coffee became, the fact that the turkey was originally domesticated in the Americas, or was grabbed from the Americas, was transferred to the Ottoman Empire, where it became domesticated and bred to a larger, meatier bird, eventually got reintroduced to the Americas. That's why we currently call them turkeys. At the same point in time, of course, Europe very much engaged in this process as well through their new colonies and colonial holdings within the Americas. There's also a lot of differences you could have pointed out. The first one, and perhaps the biggest one, is the idea of centralization. The Ottoman Empire was a much more centralized political state than Europe was. Europe, of course, was broken up between numerous various provinces, kingdoms, countries, empires, and so forth, whereas the Ottoman Empire was always consolidated under kind of one head or one leader. Of course, there's a difference in religion between the two. Primarily, Europe is a Christian continent, whereas the Ottoman Empire is an Islamic empire. But I think there's also a very interesting idea of religious toleration between the two, where there was a lot of warfare and conflict and persecution within Europe of anyone who is not Christian. Within the Islamic Empire at this point in time, within the Ottoman Empire, you did see a lot more religious toleration. Quite often, those who were not Muslim had to pay what was called the jizya, or a small tax, to remain in the country, or to avoid any kind of complications or problems, which of course was still exploitative in its own right, but certainly was a far removed from the Inquisition, for example, within Europe, where there was a wholesale persecution of anyone who's perceived as not just being not Christian, but not worshiping Christianity in the right way. And of course, the Protestant-Catholic split only heightens this, as there's tons and tons of religious persecution. Add on to that the long-term persecution of Jewish populations within Europe, and really you see the Ottoman Empire seeming much more religiously tolerant than Europe during this time period. And even with the taxation, from the Ottoman standpoint, it seemed much more profitable to essentially just, economically benefit from having a multitude of religions within their borders, rather than trying to have to spend the resources and the time trying to crack down and convert those individuals who had no interest in converting. So it's not surprising that within the Ottoman Empire there's far more religious diversity that is maintained than you see within Europe, which very quickly over time is broken down into, yes, Protestant and Catholics, but almost exclusively Christian, with the kind of small, ever persecuted Jewish population being the exception. And of course, we realize that the persecution does not end at this point in time or anytime soon, and ultimately culminates in some incredibly terrible persecutions, which we'll be talking about later in the semester. Treatment of women is another thing that a lot of people brought up within the PowerPoint question, the fact that women generally had more rights under Islamic law and under the Ottoman Empire than they did within Europe. They could own more property. They had a right to divorce oftentimes. And generally, even though they did not hold a lot of primary political positions, generally seemed to have a more larger presence within the public sphere within the Ottoman Empire than you saw typically within Europe. Another big difference is that most of the expansion that was occurring within the Ottoman Empire was occurring close to its borders, right? It was much more of a land empire where it was taking over Eastern Europe, North Africa, but still kind of connected to its home base of Turkey or the Middle East that we think of today. Whereas with the expansion that was taking place in Europe, oftentimes it was taking place overseas. It was developing the trading forts and posts across East Asia and in Africa. It was developing the colonies within the Americas. So much more kind of dispersed empires are being created within Europe as opposed to the Ottoman Empire, which is essentially just expanding off of its one maintained land formation. Plenty more similarities and differences that we could look at, but those are a couple of key ones I wanted to point out. All right, movie producers, pretend that you are a filmmaker and that you are going to be pitching a movie idea for a film set in the Ottoman, Safavid, or Mughal Empire. And what would your film be about? What genre would it fall into? And what historic people or peoples would it follow? What historic events would it cover? And what kind of plot would your film have? Overall, I love the variety of creative ideas that the class brought forward for this idea, and I think some of you might have a future in the film industry, so you might wanna think about that with some of the wonderful pitches that I heard. And there was a really good cross section of ideas coming from the various topics that we covered this week. From the Ottoman perspective, some people had ideas based around sort of the initial conquest of Osman Bey, the creation of the Ottoman Empire. Some focused on sort of the Janissary system and how that could sort of play out and what kind of stories you could build around that idea of kind of enslaved soldiers who also seemingly had a fairly high status within Ottoman society and were very sort of impressive, important warriors. At certain times almost came to kind of run the empire. And some people want to focus on Suleiman the Magnificent and sort of his conquests and his life. So some of them are more sort of documentary based. Some of them were more sort of action adventure, taking a look at more kind of the military aspect of it. But yeah, overall, very good pitches there. Some people focused on the split between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire and that idea of kind of the Shia-Sunni split, focusing on things like the Battle of Chaldiran and kind of the important impacts that conflict had. Looking at the Mughal Empire, some people focused once more on kind of the early kind of creation of it with the conquest of Babur, kind of how the transition from sort of Mongol steppe land peoples to creating or integrating, I should say, more with kind of the more century agricultural states of the Delhi region. Some people focused on Akbar and sort of his religious ideas and how he sort of came up with this idea of that sort of divine faith, which was still trying to sort of combine Islam with ideas of Hinduism while trying to make it kind of based around a real divine kingship model with himself on the top, which was certainly called into question by sort of both Hindus and his sort of Islamic followers and advisors as well. But that was sort of an attempt that he made to try to sort of create a new version, shall we say, of his imperial ruling style. Some people focus on kind of a romance story between Jahangir and Nur Jahan, the building of the Taj Mahal, sort of their relationship, and everything that sort of went along with that, with the rise to power, and some pretty fantastic stories you could sort of pull from this time period in these various empires and bring them out. And I thought the class did a very good job of doing that. I would like you to draw, paint, or graphically design three symbols, a mark, sign, or image that indicates, signifies, or is understood as representing an idea, object, or relationship that represents our three early modern Islamic dynasties, the Ottoman, Safavid, or Mughal Empire. I would then like you to explain how and why each symbol is a representation of its dynasty. And once more, just like the sort of film pitch ideas, I thought there was a lot of really good diversity in the types of symbols that I was seeing the class design for this question. Some of the symbols focused on individuals, portraying important individuals for one of the dynasties, like Suleiman the Magnificent or Babur for the Mughals. Some of them focused more on kind of symboling Ottoman, Safavid, or Mughal fashion or how they dressed. Some of the symbols were more focused on sort of religious iconography, for example, the crescent moon for Islam. More specifically, designs around 12 or Shiism for the Safavid Empire, or ideas of trying to sort of represent the divine faith that Akbar was trying to bring in to sort of the Islamic and Hindu setting in India. Also, there are lots of symbols of military strength present in all three. Of course, guns, or for like the gunpowder empires, that factored into some of the symbols that I was seeing. Some of the symbols were also more representative of economic strength. For example, the trade through the Silk Road or the Indian Ocean trade networks. Things that you might be exporting a lot of, like the Persian rugs coming from the Safavid Empire, or things that they were importing and utilizing, like coffee and coffee shops in the Ottoman Empire. And there was also, sort of important cultural symbols as well, particularly in architecture. People putting the Blue Mosque for a representation of the Ottoman Empire, or the Taj Mahal as a representation of the Mughal Empire. So, once more, a lot of different ways that people sort of took the information material from this semester, or from this section, and brought it into their answers and into their sort of visual imagery, which I thought was very well done. An overarching feature of all three empires was the ethnic and religious diversity of their populations. What measures did the rulers of the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal states take to address this diversity? In what ways did these measures strengthen their states? And yeah, looking at these three empires, you can really see that they were all multicultural empires to a large degree. And by that I mean multicultural, meaning that there were multiple different cultures, ethnicities, religions operating within their borders, not that they practiced the sort of current idea of multiculturalism. So just saying that there was a lot of varying cultures within the various empires, and a lot of different peoples within those empires as well. For example, the Ottomans were trying to rule over, obviously, people of different Turkish ethnic backgrounds, the Ottoman Turks, the Seljuk Turks, people from the Arabian Peninsula, Europeans in South or in Eastern Europe. So a wide range of different peoples that they are sort of incorporating under their banner. Same way with the Safavid Empire. Once more, having sort of different Turkish ethnic groups present there, combining with kind of the old sort of Persian elements of that area, which had always been sort of strong and dated all the way back really to the sort of previous iterations of the Persian Empire in sort of the Antiquity time period. And the Mughal Empire very much once more combining sort of the Turkish peoples who had come down to form the Mughal Empire, but with plenty of Persian Empire. Still influences there in sort of northern India, as well, of course, with the sort of Indian population of India as well, the very large Hindu population, as well as the other sort of religious groups within India. So yeah, all these empires were very much in control of an area that had a lot of diversity and variability within them. And really, to a large degree, you can see that both empires sort of practiced both policies of inclusion and exclusion for sort of the varying diverse populations and people that they were that they were sort of ruling over. For example, the Ottoman Empire, on the one hand, was sort of very seen as sort of protecting the religious minorities within their borders, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, the various sects of Islam, Sufism, for example. But at the same point in time, they still imposed the jizya, sort of tax on those people who were non-Muslim, but it certainly wasn't sort of kind of the state policy to try to convert these groups, more just sort of let them do their own thing as long as they didn't cause any trouble. But they still had to sort of pay a tax and a contribution to the state. But at the same point in time, they're also involved in sort of the janissary system, right, of either capturing or forcing tribute from Christian populations in Eastern Europe, to provide them with these sort of slave soldiers that they would use to sort of strengthen their empire. And certainly, this sort of gives you an example of the very wide differing ways that slavery can take and the various forms it can take. Because the Janissary slave system was nowhere close to what we saw developing in sort of the chattel slave systems of the Americas, right? The Janissaries, while they were technically slaves, ultimately held a very high status position within the Ottoman state. And for the most part, the Janissaries oftentimes sort of led sort of better, wealthier lives of more prestige and power than the majority of the population did. So even though they couldn't sort of leave and choose to do something else, it certainly wasn't the sort of very harsh, degrading lifestyle that we saw in the exploitation of enslaved individuals in the Americas. But still, certainly it was going to be a burden on the families who were losing children to this system. And certainly anyone in the Janissary system who didn't necessarily want to be a Janissary was not going to be able to find this system very fair or rewarding either. But still, kind of a way to sort of see the nuances there. Of course, the Ottoman Empire was also dealing with sort of those ethnic tensions. The Wahhabi movement, for example, was a movement by a lot of the sort of groups in the Arabian Peninsula, which sort of felt like they were really the sort of founders of Islam and should be the caretakers of it, and sort of a lot of pushback against the Ottoman state, sort of viewing the Ottomans as sort of the Turkish background to them as kind of being interlopers and not necessarily sort of the true bearers of the Islamic faith. So that's always going to be causing tensions all the way up until the dissolution and dissolving of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, which we'll be sort of circling back around and touching upon. The Safavid Empire, for their portion, was very welcoming of sort of Persian ideas and customs. Really, they based most of their empire and imperial structures upon sort of those foundations of Persian culture, which is so strong in the area. And they were also sort of the only empire that allowed a little bit more Christian influence in their area in the form of advisors. Also, the fact that they wanted to sort of make alliances with some of the Christian nations against the Ottoman Empire, against the Portuguese in the Persian Gulf. That these were all reasons why they were sort of inclusion of some groups, but at the same point in time they were very exclusionary. Particularly the fact that the Safavids were the sort of main area of Shia Islam and were very persecuting of Sunnis within their borders. Of course, most of the Ottoman Empire was Sunni, and that, of course, is one of the reasons that led to a lot of conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, was this sort of religious difference between them. And kind of back to the idea of the Ottoman Empire having these multiple Islamic sects, it's important to remember that Islam, just like Christianity, has lots of different branches of it. It's not just this one holistic thing. There's various ways to interpret it. There's various ideas and readings of history and what happened, who should have been sort of the proper standard bearer of the Prophet's message throughout time. Those are all things that still, even up to this current day, just like sort of the Protestant Catholic split is still resonant today, so is the Sunni and Shia split. And that's very much sort of exacerbated through this time period as the Safavids become so exclusionary. And if you look up to the modern day, the biggest Sunni country or Shia country in the world is Iran, and Iran, of course, is essentially just a what the Safavid Empire sort of turns into throughout time. So up until this current day, you can really see sort of the religious landscape is very much influenced by these empires. Also, if you look at the Mughal Empire, you kind of see something mirroring what we saw in the Ottoman and the Safavids. Some rulers are going to be sort of very tolerant towards religion. Akbar, for example, you really sort of saw him trying to kind of unite India by combining various elements of the faith. As of course, there was a large Hindu population, there was a Jain population, population of other religions within their borders. But at the same point in time, then he's trying to sort of combine these into a new religious ideology with himself kind of at the top, that I have sort of a divine faith, where there was, at the one hand, a lot of sponsoring discussions between Muslims and Hindus and Jains and Zoroastrians and Christians, trying to kind of find the commonalities between them and trying to incorporate a lot of those into sort of this almost new religion that he's trying to form. But of course, that's going to antagonize a lot of sort of the his power base and his power structure, which were still so very devoutly part of Islam, and certainly were not comfortable with the way that he was trying to sort of take those news ideas. So it's not surprising that you saw sort of a pushback against that. Um, for example, Shah Ahmad Sindiri and Aurangzeb very much sort of pushed back upon this by reinstating the jizya, pushing Hindus out of positions of power within the government, and even going so far as to sort of attack Hindu temples. So you can kind of see it was various leaders taking various approaches, and this is something just sort of as a commonality that you see between these various empires, is that oftentimes it seems like the rulers saw that tolerance was very necessary for running this kind of multicultural empire. That without that, it would lead to a lot more problems, a lot more rebellions, the government not being operate as effectively or as efficiently, and having to ultimately spend sort of more money to combat these problems than it would take to just sort of be a little bit more tolerant and have those problems not crop up. On the other hand, though, these rulers were very much in all cases, supported by a very devout religious elite group who very much wanted to push and strengthen their own religion within the regions. So there was obviously oftentimes sort of pressure from those groups to maybe not be quite as tolerant as the rulers perhaps wanted to be. So there's sort of an interplay between these various aspects within the cultures throughout time. Still, overall, though, I would say that religious minorities in these empires were generally treated better than their counterparts in other areas of the world. For example, Europe, or looking at Christians in Japan, how sort of they're being persecuted there. Certainly, if you're going to be talking about a Jewish individual at this point in time, they would have been much better off living in the Ottoman Empire, for example, than in Europe, where they were almost constantly going to be persecuted against and forced to live in sort of very separate communities, and oftentimes the being attacked by the state or by religious individuals in those countries for their religious beliefs, and a lot of times they're being forced and pushed farther and farther east. That's why you eventually see such a large Jewish population in areas like Poland and Western Russia, is going to be because essentially they were sort of driven out and forced out from all the other locations that they had been in. So certainly, if you're looking at sort of that gauge, these empires were quite a bit more tolerant than some of their counterparts around the world at this time. All right, that's what we have for this question. So PowerPoint question number 5, why do you think these three empires were all able to form in a similar fashion around the same time period? This is a relatively difficult question. I know it's not without having a real detailed knowledge of kind of the political background of the regions. It's kind of hard to piece this together. But I thought a lot of you tried very hard and ended up coming up with some pretty good answers. And pretty much I gave most people credit for just trying to make an attempt to answer this question. First of all, you really do see a shift in kind of the regional power bases that we were talking about in each of them, with the decline of the Mongol empires, with the Ilkhans, the decline of the Seljuk Turks, along with the Byzantine Empire, and the decline of the Kingdom of Delhi in northern India, and really kind of left a power vacuum in a lot of ways that these new kind of incoming powers were able to utilize. The main thing that allowed them to really kind of take advantage of this, I would say, was that idea of them kind of taking over the trading obligations, trading functions, establishing the contacts between Eastern Asia as well as kind of the Middle East. Now this allowed them to become kind of those masters of gunpowder that they were able to use to help kind of take over this territory, to form and sustain themselves once they were entrenched and they were in place. And also the fact that they were able to kind of, to a certain degree compete with one another, but also to a certain degree kind of rely on each other and provide examples to one another of how, the kind of empire should be built, constructed, and run at this period in time. To looking at our history document, the Turkish letters. So starting off here under question number 1, how does Busbek describe the Ottoman Empire, and what aspects does he choose to focus on? Oftentimes, like our documents, you're going to be able to find quotations or sections of the document that might apply to various of these. I just broke them down into a couple of key areas that I saw all of you drawing from in your answers for this week. So first thing that Busbek talks about is at Buda, I made my first acquaintance with Janissaries. This is the name by which the Turks call the infantry of the Royal Guard. So talking about the Janissaries starts off with. And he goes into some discussion and description of them. A garrison of Janissaries is always stationed at the citadel of Buda. The dress of these men consists of a robe reaching down to the ankles, while to cover their heads they employ a cowl, which by their account was originally a cloak sleeve, part of which contains the head, while the remainder hangs down and flaps against the neck. So kind of describing the fashion or the clothing that these Janissaries are wearing. Interesting that that's one of the things he's looking at and focusing on, particularly the ones that he is coming into contact with. Moving on, he describes some of their behavior, kind of in this first one, kind of interesting how they're kind of acting like they'd like a tip for the services that they're rendering here. He says, after reaching the door, they would stand respectfully with their arms crossed and their eyes bent on the ground, looking more like monks than warriors. On receiving a few small coins, which they had wanted, they bowed again, thanked me in loud tones, and went off, blessing me for my kindness. Now, some people interpreted this as them, somehow begging for this money, that they really needed it. That is because they weren't getting paid enough in their jobs. I don't think it should be interpreted necessarily in that way. I think it's more of a fact that they were kind of used to a culture of reciprocity, where if you provide a service for someone, you get compensated for it, and they were simply expecting their guests to follow through with those same kind of cultural tendencies. Not that they necessarily really needed this money, not that they weren't getting paid enough, but that it was just kind of a cultural way of saying thank you when someone is, essentially kind of being polite to you. It's very similar if you think about it today. If you have someone bring your luggage up to a room in a hotel room, you're kind of expected to tip them. Moving on here, the next thing he really focuses on is the Turkish army and how they conduct their warfare. He says here, the Turkish monarch going to war takes with him over 400 camels, nearly as many baggage mules, of which a great part are loaded with rice and other kinds of grains. Kind of talking about the supply of them. And I think in the next kind of couple sections here, there was another kind of misinterpretation that some people had this week. He starts off by saying here that the invading army carefully abstains from encroaching on its magazines. Magazines here, he's talking about its supplies or its store at the outset. So he's saying that the army is careful from using too much of its supplies at the beginning of the conflict, as they are well aware that when the season for campaigning draws to a close, they will have to retreat over districts wasted by the enemy. And this is really setting up the context for these next two lines here. What he's really saying is that even though they're well supplied, that they're very good at using their supplies and making them stretch, because at the beginning of a conflict, they don't use too much of them, so that as the conflict draws out, for example, a long siege, and the land kind of becomes barren or is wasted by the enemy, as he says, that the army is not going to starve and it's not going to be forced to retreat. It's just kind of the natural process that warfare takes, and rather than criticizing the Sultan here for not bringing enough food or resources or being cheap or anything like that, what he's really saying is that the Ottomans are very, very smart in the way they utilize their resources. They don't use too much at the beginning, and they kind of ration themselves for the long haul. And the next few sentences here really only backed it up. He says, when the Sultan's magazines are opened, a ration just sufficient to sustain life is daily weighted out. Once more, the idea of rationing themselves so they don't use up too much of their supplies, so the army actually doesn't starve, so that they're forced to retreat from a conflict. Once more, he goes on down below to say, sometimes they have to recourse to horse flesh. Dead horses are, of course, plentiful in their great hosts, and such beasts are in good condition when they die, furnish a meal not just to be despised by famished soldiers. Once more, this seems surprising to Busbek, but this probably shouldn't be surprising to us, realizing that the Ottoman Empire has its roots in kind of the steppeland empires and the kind of great horsemen that lived out there, where horses were pretty much the main way to wealth and power, particularly within the military, and that it was very routine to use horses to survive off of, whether by drinking their blood for water, whether by eating them when they died, and that this would not have been at all unusual for a group that had its roots within a nomadic kind of lifestyle. And certainly was another reason why they were able to keep themselves going and become a very effective army for a sustained period of time. Finally, he goes on to say and talk about kind of how the Ottoman Empire seems to be more of a meritocracy than Europe, meaning that more can be achieved based upon what one has accomplished, what they know, what skills they have, rather than simply the position that they were born into. A lot of people remarked on this for question number 3, which is why I marked more of it, and we'll be going over that shortly. But I just want to point out here that this is certainly one of the topics he talks about. For example, when he says, no distinction is attached to birth among the Turks. The difference to be paid to a man is measured by the position he holds in the public service. So talking more about what he has achieved, not necessarily his birth, and of course he expounds on that. Now it's important to note that Busbecq here isn't necessarily being 100% accurate, that there was certainly still a lot of social division within the Ottoman Empire, but he is striking enough that he does make a very clear depiction and distinction between what he observes in Europe and what he does observe here. So going on to question number 2, what comparisons does Busbecq make between the Ottoman Empire and Europe, and who does he feel is the more powerful force? Moving down in this paragraph here, he really talks about the contrast that he sees between the two armies. Remember, right above here, he complimented really the Islamic Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, for how well they're able to ration their supplies and maintain control of their army through kind of hard times in a campaign. And this is the main area where he kind of starts this comparison here. He says, from this, you will see that it is the patience, self-denial, and thrift of the Turkish soldier that enables him to face the most trying circumstances. He then goes on to say, what a contrast to our men, talking about the European soldiers. Christian soldiers on campaign refused to put up with their ordinary food and called for thrushes, beneficios, a small bird esteemed a dainty as it feeds on figs and grapes, such like dainty dishes. Now this is probably an exaggeration, that all Christian soldiers are sitting there saying we're not going to fight unless we get thrushes, but he is saying that there's more likelihood that there's going to be complaints on the side of Christian soldiers, that they might have higher expectations going into the conflict than what he was observing with the Ottoman soldiers. He kind of backs us up, talking about kind of the society in general and how kind of this observation of the troops is just a part of that. He says, on their side is a vast wealth of their empire, unimpaired resources, experience and practice in arms, a veteran soldiery, an uninterrupted series of victories, readiness to endure hardship, union, order, discipline, thrift, and watchfulness. All things that he's characterizing within the Ottoman Empire and within the Ottoman military. He compares it then and says, on ours are found an empty exchequer, essentially that's meaning a treasury, so an empty treasury as opposed to kind of the wealth of the Ottoman Empire he talks about up here. Luxurious habits, exhausted resources, broken spirits, a raw and insubordinate soldiery, and greedy quarrels. There is no regard for discipline, license runs riot, and men indulge in drunkenness and debauchery, and worst of all, the enemy is accustomed to victory, we to defeat. Can we doubt what the result must be? Pretty much saying here that any large-scale sustained conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the European powers was going to lead to victory for the Ottoman Empire because of all the kind of qualities he lists above here, and of course kind of debasing the effectiveness of their European counterparts. Once more, perhaps not 100% accurate for all the armies in Europe, but it is interesting that he's drawing this comparison and is placing the Ottoman Empire militarily and organizedly and structurally on kind of such a higher level than the empires that he's used to, or the kingdoms that he's used to. Finally, moving down once more to this idea and making this comparison of the meritocracy between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. He says, they, meaning the Ottomans, do not believe that high qualities are either natural or hereditary, nor do they think that they can be handed down from father to son, kind of the idea of primogeniture, which is so popular within Europe at this point in time. But that they are partially the gift of God and partially the result of good training, great industry, and unwearied zeal. So really talking that the presence and the idea within the Ottoman Empire is that partially they're gifts that people are naturally born with. They attribute that to God, and partially the training, the hard work, and the industry, rather than thinking that good qualities are simply handed down from father to son or kind of through the family line, as was very commonplace within Europe at this point in time. Think about the vast power that the aristocracy held within these kingdoms, how oftentimes the aristocracy were the ones who were in government positions, who were running the empires, and a lot of times this was regardless of how good they actually were at their job. Same thing within the military, they were the ones leading the military. And this is another distinction that Busbecq makes here between the Ottoman Empire and the European countries, is that the Ottomans are run much more on merit rather than simply being appointed based on birth. And once more, he backs this up at the end. He says, "This is the reason that they are successful in their undertakings, that they lord it over others, and are daily extending their bounds of the empire. These are not our ideas. With us, there is no opening left for merit. Birth is the standard for everything. The prestige of birth is the sole key to advancement in public service." Once more, not saying that there was no hierarchy within the Ottoman Empire, there certainly was, but he's certainly saying here, particularly in public service, that there's far more roles for advancement within the Ottoman Empire than there was within most of the European kingdoms at this point in time. All right, moving on to question number 3. What aspect of Ottoman culture, religion, or society do you find the most interesting, and why? And I just picked out a couple of the areas that you had identified that I thought would be good to bring back up. The first one is in this first area where he's talking about the Janissaries. He says, "They are scattered through every part of the empire, either to garrison the forts against the enemy or to protect Christians and Jews from the violence of the mob." Now, we had already mentioned earlier about how the Ottoman Empire in general was a lot more tolerant of religion than European empires were. And this kind of backs that up, the idea that there's actually an organized, systematic method of protecting people of religious minorities. Certainly, of course, the fact that they need protection suggests that there is still violence and there is still intolerance within society. But the fact that at the highest level there seems to be an effort to combat that is something you really do not see at all within Europe at this point in time, where anyone who is not a Christian is oftentimes being persecuted, hunted after, or in some other way, shape, or form separated from the rest of Christian society, and is usually persecuted against or forced to convert, if you think about the actions of the Inquisition, for example. Moving down here, talking once more about the difference within the armies and how Busbecq really feels that the Ottoman Empire's army is advanced or more well-trained or better than the European armies. And right after he says here that we can doubt what the result must be, essentially saying that the Ottoman Empire in a sustained conflict would triumph over Europe, is very interesting where he accredits that this has not already happened. He says the only obstacle is Persia. Remember the Safavid Empire, whose position on his rear forces the invader to take precautions. The fear of Persia gives us respite, but it is only for a time. And really here he is crediting the Safavid Empire applying pressure on kind of the opposite side of the Ottoman Empire for the only real reasons that the Ottoman Empire has not already conquered Europe, which I think is pretty interesting. May not be 100% accurate, but I think it certainly plays a point that if the Ottoman Empire did not have to fear an invading force on one of their borders, it's entirely possible they could have put a lot more pressure on Europe. And we saw with the Siege of Vienna how close they ultimately came to kind of breaking through into the Holy Roman Empire, and who knows where it would have extended from there. So I think it's interesting how much credit the author here gives to the fact that essentially they're kind of fighting a two-front war, and that is why they haven't been more successful. But if it was a one-on-one matchup, that Europe would be in real serious trouble. Finally, a lot of people really pointed out this idea of the meritocracy, and a couple more quotes that back this up. He says, "In making his appointments, the Sultan pays no regard to any pretensions on the score of wealth or rank, nor does he take into consideration recommendations or popularity. He considers each case on its own merits and examines carefully into the character, ability, and disposition of the man whose promotion is in question. It is by merit that men rise in the service, a system which ensures that posts should only be assigned to the competent." Of course, he's making a comparison that this is not the way it's currently being run in Europe, and it might not be as glowing as he makes it sound here, that there was still nepotism within the Ottoman Empire, but that there was more of a chance of people being recognized for their hard work and for their merits and being promoted within the Ottoman Empire than existed within Europe. Okay, that is everything for this week. Thank you all very much. And of course, as always, if you have any questions about the document exercise, the PowerPoint questions, your grades, or anything else, contact me. Let me know. Have a great week.